want to welcome those who will be joining us via YouTube video whenever you see it. This is the Morehead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the Revelation of John, and tonight we'll be in Revelation chapter 16. We're going to finish the second half of this chapter. So before we get into tonight's study, I would like to just sort of review briefly the first half of chapter 16. So you'll recall that in the first half of Revelation 16, a voice from the temple in heaven commands 7 angels who had the 7 plagues and were each given a bowl full of wrath of God to one by one pour out their bowls of wrath on imperial Rome. The first bowl resulted in painful sores. The second bowl resulted in the devastation of the sea with blood. The third bowl devastated the rivers and springs with blood. The fourth bowl resulted in scorching heat upon the earth. The fifth bowl was darkness over the empire of Rome. God is punishing Rome with the fullness of his wrath for their wickedness. And there are yet 2 bowls to be poured out in this chapter. So with that being said, we're going to read verses 12 through 16. So Brian, if you're ready with that, if you want to read that.
The 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are demonic spirits, performing signs, who go abroad to the kings of the whole world, to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. And they assemble them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon.
All right.
That sounds like it's talking about the Lord's return. The Armageddon. Just exactly what it's.
Well, I mean, I like to start with verse 12, and
Uh-huh.
we're going to get there in verse 16. But if I do that now, then it's really going to turn everything around. But let's just start with verse 12, because we should have plenty of time to get to that. Again, this is now the 6th bowl of judgment. First of all, I'd like to share with you a couple of thoughts from premillennialists in terms of how they look at it. Everything for them is future. In other words, none of this stuff has happened. Got to have a rapture that takes place sometime in the future, and after this rapture, those who are left behind on earth during the tribulation period, the 7 years, this happens during that. So none of this has happened for them. Okay, so the first one here, I got 2 of them here, is John F. Walford, Every Prophecy of the Bible. Clear explanations for uncertain times by one of today's premier prophecy scholars. He says, quote, the Euphrates River will be dried up, and this will prepare for military invasion by the kings of the East, probably including rulers of China and other countries, unquote. Mark Creech, writing an article for the Christian Post entitled Revelation 16, When the Great River Runs Dry, says, quote, neither is it clear what specific enemy the kings of the East are crossing the dried Euphrates River to fight. He says some scholars propose the reference to the kings of the East crossing the Euphrates signifies a military movement in a specific region, such as the Middle East or Asia. This interpretation suggests the kings of the East may be involved in regional conflicts or power struggles rather than a global war. Others suggest the kings of the East will go to war against the Antichrist and his global forces of evil in the end times. It is believed that they will take part in the final battle of Armageddon, joining forces with other nations against the Antichrist regime. Still others say the kings of the East will wage war against Israel in the end times. This theory suggests they may be motivated by geopolitical or religious reasons to engage in a conflict with Israel. What is clear, however, is whatever the reason, God sees it as an assault on his sovereignty. Whatever the reason, God is bringing about judgment by allowing evil and turning it in its course. He is corralling these nations into one place, Armageddon, also known as the Mount of Megiddo, to destroy them, and paving the way for Christ, his people, to rule and reign. So you're reading all these sources of premillennialists. I got a lot of different ideas about what's taking place here in terms of the sixth bowl. And so when we look at it in terms of trying to really understand what's going on here, first it's probably good that we sort of take a little bit of time to think about the Euphrates River. This is a major thing that's happening here, is mention of the Euphrates River, and so I'm going to just share a few facts about it before we get into really how it's being used here. And so Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says that it's the longest river of Western Asia and one of two major rivers in Mesopotamia. The river begins in the mountains of Armenia in modern-day Turkey. It then heads west towards the Mediterranean Sea, turns to the south, swings in a wide bow through Syria, and then flows some 1,000 miles southeast to join the Tigris River before it empties into the Persian Gulf. The Euphrates is about 1,780 miles, and it is one of the four rivers that is mentioned in terms of the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 and verse 14. When we look at it in terms of our study of the book of Revelation, the river Euphrates have already been mentioned, and that was back in Revelation 9 and verse 14 in the sixth trumpet judgment. Wayne Jackson says that, quote, the Euphrates was associated with the region from which came the chief enemies of Israel during the Old Testament era, that is, Assyria and Babylon. Now in pouring out the sixth bowl of God's wrath, the Euphrates is completely dried up. It removes a barrier to invasion, thus opening the door for enormous armies to easily cross or travel the dry riverbed. And so what you have is sort of this becomes more vulnerable. The idea that the Euphrates, if you look at sort of the map, the idea that that's dried up essentially opens them up from an assault from really the north. But after it's mentioned about what the sixth bowl is in verse 12, all of a sudden it really goes to sort of what the circumstances in relation to that in verses 13 through 16. J.W. Roberts, in his commentary, The Revelation of John, the Living Word Commentary, says, quote, ultimately the imagery is probably dependent, as in other places, on the very real dread in the Roman world of Eastern Parthian forces. Jewish apocalyptic literature had expressed the expectation of these kings as a means of punishing Rome. And so we really understand the book of Revelation in the real time in which it's written, in which John is in Patmos, on the island of Patmos. The Apostle John, the seven churches of Asia are encountering severe persecution. We realize that the power that's in control of this is Rome. We know the problem that's going on in terms of the suffering for Christians, or the suffering and persecution of Christians, and that is they're being forced to worship the emperor. And the worship of the emperor decided that he was going to be Lord God, and he expected everybody in his empire to worship him, and Christians couldn't do that because, of course, that's idolatry. And because of that, they were suffering. So, is there any questions about verse 12 before we get to verse 13? Okay, now let's go to verse 13. John continues. Now again, the key thing as we go through the text here is John has seen a vision. If we don't keep that in mind, then then it's going to be problematic in terms of our understanding. This is all a vision. It's like seeing something that you're seeing all of this imagery. And this is what John is doing. He's simply writing it down, and all of the imagery is really written for the encouragement of Christians that were suffering persecution. In verse 13, John says, "And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs." Now again, we're going to have trouble if we make things literal. We already know who the dragon is. The dragon is who?
Devil.
Is Satan. Very good. And it talks about the beast, something come out of the mouth of the beast. Who's the beast?
Rome.
Okay, it would be imperial Rome. And out of the mouth of the false prophet, when you go back to chapter 13 of Revelation, verse 11, the false prophet is also the earth beast, or the concilla, the Roman concilla, that were responsible for forcing everybody to worship the emperor. And so what John sees in this vision, okay, he sees a dragon, he sees a beast, he sees a false prophet. Out of their mouth, of course, unclean spirits, it says, like frogs. And the mention of frogs here seems to be for the purpose of keeping with the imagery of the plagues of Egypt. This is kind of what we've seen with all these bowl judgments. The idea is all in keeping with that. Again, apocalyptic language is sort of coded language. It's very symbolic. It portrays things that are going to come to pass in imagery. It essentially, in this message, is a message of hope to God's people. And the idea ultimately is that God's people are going to triumph. This is quoted because if it falls in the hands of the Roman Empire, and it was spoken plainly, this might increase their persecution. It said, well, you know, the Roman Empire is really going to suffer greatly because they persecuted you. So a lot of the imagery that we see here is pulled from the Old Testament. Christians were well acquainted with the Old Testament. The judgments that God used against their enemies back in the Old Testament, sometimes used against them, was put in sort of symbolic and figurative expression. But the idea is it represented judgment. These frogs, however, of course, are not frogs that are essentially sent by God, but according to the vision that John sees, they're actually unclean spirits. And obviously, in terms of the plagues of Egypt, the plague of frogs was devastating. That was the second plague in Exodus 7:25 through 8:15. Very devastating. But these 3 frogs, in their own way, will bring about devastating results. Again, the number 3 shouldn't be taken literal in biblical numerology, especially if we're looking at the book of Revelation. The idea here seems to be it's sort of a perfect number, a perfect amount, in this case, the idea of 3, and that they are unclean. And Thayer's Greek English Lexicon says this: they're unclean in the sense of the moral sense, unclean in thought and in life. These 3 frogs are very unclean. They represent the evil influences of all 3 of the mouths that they came from: the dragon, the sea beast, and the false prophets. Okay, if you have any questions, just raise your hand as we're
The
going.
false prophet, let me try to think who that was. I know there's Rome as the beast, right?
Yeah, the sea beast. The beast that came out of the sea is Imperial Rome.
Figuratively speaking.
Right.
And then there's
The earth beast.
The unclean spirits is definitely the devil and stuff. And who's the prophet? I've heard it before.
Yeah, the false prophet is going to be the earth beast in Revelation 13 and verse 11.
So would that go back to Rome?
That goes back to those who are really the Roman Concilia. They were responsible in their regional areas, the local areas, for making sure that everybody worshiped the beast or worshiped the emperor. And if not, they were responsible for essentially making them suffer, whatever degree that was, whether it was economic persecution or discrimination, or if they were incarcerated, or if they were put to death. So they were the enforcers. You kind of look at the earth beast or the false prophet as sort of they were enforcing what the sea beast demanded, worship. So they worked together. And of course, both of these beasts are working in harmony with the
But they
dragon.
actually wasn't, they're figuratively being called the beast.
Right. Right.
And stuff.
So you're coding the language. So they're not,
Yeah.
Rome is not, the people of Rome, if they get a copy of this, are not going to be able to figure out who this is talking about,
Mhm.
because it's not saying it by name. And so the idea is that Christians would have understood when they got this letter. They would have been saying, who's this talking about? They would have had understanding to all of the imagery and the symbolism, who this was getting at.
Okay.
Okay? Let's go on to verse 14. Now it's talking about those three frogs. It says, for they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole earth to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. So I'm just going to have one quote here from a premillennialist, Tim LaHaye, in his commentary of Revelation Illustrated, made plain. He said, these deceiving spirits, by working miracles before the kings of the earth and the whole world, will trick them to come together for the battle of the great day of the Almighty, the conflict, or the final conflict against God and his Christ. And so they look at this in relation to what's a lot of times referred to in verse 16 as the Battle of Armageddon. But as we look at this, we want to see here that John reveals to us that the three frog-like creatures that each came out of the dragon, the sea beast, and the false prophets are spirits of demons. And you'll recall that demons, of course, are like Satan. They're all fallen angels. They were all, at one time, all in good standing with God. And before the world was, there was some kind of fallout, some kind of rebellion. And it seems to have been spearheaded by Satan. And essentially, they essentially were cast out of heaven. They no longer were in good standing with God. And the difference really between angels sinning and human sinning is that humans essentially can find forgiveness through Jesus Christ.
That's before God created the world, though.
Right.
And stuff.
But the angels, essentially, because they're in the presence of God, there is no plan of salvation for them because they had an advantage that we don't have.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were actually in God's presence.
Aren't the angels are perfect too, aren't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're,
In a sense.
right. They essentially have the ability to...
But they had the right to choose.
They have free
choice.
will. Right.
Yeah.
They have free will because obviously, because there's Satan and because there are demons, that's an exercise of free will to rebel against the
Can
rule
they
of
still
God.
do that today? I mean, the angels, if they want.
Well, it appears that if they any more want to rebel, they could, because they still have free will.
Do you think it has been added then? To,
Well, I mean, that's pure speculation. I
Yeah.
wouldn't know. It doesn't make any sense, essentially, for any more to do that because essentially they're going to be
They
lost
see what
forever.
happened.
But it doesn't make sense today for Christians to leave the Lord. You think any more Christians are going to leave? Well, yeah. Does it make sense? No. Because essentially, when you're in good standing with God, you don't ever want to use your free will to sort of fall out of God's grace
No.
and in favor. So, yeah. So John reveals that these spirits are demons. They work with Satan to accomplish his evil work. And here in John's vision, so imagine John is seeing this. Imagine he sees a dragon, sees a sea beast, he sees a false prophet, he sees like frog-like creatures come out of their mouth. They're working miracles, so this doesn't mean in actuality, but in his vision. What he's seeing there, that portrayal, in that vision, they're working miracles. And it appears that this is done for the express purpose of bringing really the kings of the world together, as the verse ends here, for the war of the great day of God, the Almighty. And when we think a little bit about that word, and we're going to talk about what the kings and things are here right now, but what does the word Almighty reflect when you think about that in terms of...
All powerful.
Okay, absolutely. So the idea of an all-powerful, this is applied to God. He's omnipotent, that would be sort of reflecting the same idea. And it's really indicating God's supremacy over all things. In other words, Man can oppose God all he wants, and he can bring together as many people as he wants against God. But you see, you can't ever really defeat God, no matter how many are against God, because he's God. He's the creator.
It's best to
He
give in
reigns
to
supreme over all of his
God
creatures.
than fight him, because you're not going to win.
Right.
And stuff, and eventually you're going to be in judgment.
Right. You're going to fall under his rules, whether you want to live by them or not.
You got to learn to like his ways, whether you like him or not. I mean,
Right.
and to do that, you got to become a Christian, and after that, you're
Yeah.
saved. You've got to learn to adjust to like his ways.
Right.
It's not always easy.
Right.
And stuff, but you know, when
Yeah.
you're saved, you understand more
it's-
about God.
Right. Right.
And
It's
so-
like talking to a nutritionist and say, which is better for me, a bag of chips or broccoli or Brussels sprouts? Which one tastes better? Well, the chips,
Yeah.
unless you like Brussels or broccoli.
I like Brussels sprouts better, actually.
But the idea is when you look at the truth is the vegetables are better for you, even though they may not, you put in the vegetables you don't like. Whatever vegetables you don't like, they're actually better for you than what tastes good. And the same thing with God's word. So I'm saying that the idea is whatever you like to do or want to do may not be in your best interest, but whatever God says for you to do is certainly good for you and your best interest. You should always do this because that's better for you than essentially what you think. And that's really my whole point. So let's talk about what's going on here with the kings of the whole earth gathering together for war. So some commentators that are not premillennialists, so we've got other ideas in terms of few different ideas about what's happening here. So some commentators that are not premillennialists believe that the kings of the east, number one, represent Christ and his coming saints. That's very hard to get that from reading that. There's nowhere else that we can really connect with that to come to that conclusion unless you're going to chapter 19 and you're making a connection there. Others take the kings of verse 12 and 14 as kings fighting against each other at Armageddon. In other words, there's going to be this big fight, and it's going to take place on that ground. This is believed to be the Roman Empire against its enemies. So not everybody was for the Roman Empire, and so basically you have these armies amassing there, the Roman army versus all of these other against them, and there's this big battle right there at Armageddon. In Revelation 19 and verse 19, we want to look at that and read that as we're kind of working through this. So Jenna, if you want to read Revelation 19:19.
Chapter 19, verse 19?
Yep, 19:19.
You're going out of the chapter where, yeah, let's see.
And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat upon the horse and against his army.
Okay, so another way commentators see this is that all the kings with their massive armies merged together. In other words, that unclean spirit sort of tricks them sort of all to come together, and they're going to come together to fight against God. So it seems more likely to understand the kings that are mentioned in Revelation 16:12 and in Revelation 16:14, all being brought together by the dragon in an effort to wage war against God to defeat him. Again, this is a divinely inspired vision. In other words, somebody's going to say, well, there's no way that it's going to ever happen. I know that, and you know that. I'm saying this is what John is seeing in the vision. So all of these armies come together. John is seeing this, probably what the case is, and they're coming together to fight against God himself. Again, this is a divinely inspired vision, and so John is sort of seeing this. All these forces of evil align themselves in order to defeat God. And what we know, of course, is that the forces of Satan are no match for God. And the whole point is the Christians that would be reading this would know that too. In other words, as they sort of seen the Imperial Rome as being this incredible superpower, and everybody essentially has to fall down and do what they want. And if they don't, terrible things are going to happen to them. And the idea that the psychological effect, like who can beat this machine? And the idea in reading this is, well, they're no match for God.
Sounds like the world that's against the Lord's church.
Right, they can bring together all of the armies they want of the world, and they can fight against God, but you see they can't
Well,
win.
that's what they're doing. The world against the Lord's church is what that sounds like.
Well, it's not really it's really, in context, it's really talking about, right, the forces of evil, and in particular to these Christians, the idea of imperial Rome. So you're seeing this, you're suffering for Christ, and you're trying to be faithful, and you're discouraged maybe about it, you're really trying to hang in there, and you see what John writes this down, explains the idea, says, wow, well, there's no way they can win. And here this imperial Rome is over us now, according to this vision. The idea is they're going to get beat, and we're on the right team, and they're not.
Well, very few is called, and many are called, few are chosen.
Yeah.
And stuff, and they're not going to beat the Lord's church. They think they are, and stuff. So the Lord's church is going to prevail.
Right,
so,
right. So the Roman Empire, even though they're very great, the ancient Roman Empire was very great, they're no match for God.
No.
And essentially, if you're on God's team, this is encouraging, because sometimes the reality of day-to-day life in a situation where people are suffering and dying and persecuted severely may be very discouraging. But then you read this and you're like, you know what? It's going to be okay. God's got this. It's going to be okay. And so they can draw encouragement from it.
The world thinks they know everything about what, these lying denominations, but the Lord's church that are true Christians and really know God, know what's going on, knows what's up and stuff, and,
Yeah, I'm just trying to put in context of the presence that these
I know
Christians
you're talking
are
about
doing.
Rome, Rome that tried to do
So that's
tried
really
to
the
defeat-
context I really want to focus on, so that we don't lose sight of really the interpretation here. Let's go on to verse 15. John says, behold, he's quoting Christ, behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his garments, lest he walk about naked and men see his shame. So I'm going to read one premillennialist here before we go through the text. Damon R. Duck, in his commentary, Revelation, God's Word for the Biblically Inept, says, quote, it is Jesus who says, I come like a thief. This means the coming of Jesus will be a surprise. This is a reference to the coming of Jesus at the end of the tribulation period. The unclean spirits will gather the armies of the world at Armageddon, and only then will Jesus return and catch them by surprise. And so, again, if you think about sort of the end times, this is how they're describing it, sort of scenario. You have the rapture, the silent coming of Christ. Everybody disappears that are alive on earth. People are wondering where some people went. All the dead in Christ essentially go with Christ, the silent coming. They stay in heaven for 7 years. Simultaneously on earth, you have the tribulation period. Revelation chapter 4 through 19 are all about the tribulation period. So we're talking about 7 years within those chapters. And at the end of the 7 years, of course, we have, the battle of Armageddon unfolds, but we have Christ coming back. They call that the second coming, but really the rapture is one phase of second coming, and then the revelation is the second phase of the second coming. So I want to draw our attention to the word behold here. The Greek word here means is an exclamation of one pointing out something and calling attention to it. So Jesus is indicating a fact that he's mentioned before. When we look at the book of Revelation, chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief. And so he mentions this to the church there. And the idea, of course, is element of surprise. The thief comes to steal at the most opportune time for him, and when his victim least expects it. Jesus will use this expression several times in the Gospels as a way to promote preparedness. In other words, I'm not coming when you expect me to come. I'm never coming when you expect me. I'm coming when you least expect it. Okay, so the idea is that knowing that God is going to come when you least expect it, when Christ comes when you least, we should always be in a state of preparedness. Christians must have his life together spiritually at all times in anticipation of the second coming of Christ or in the event of his death. The words here, stays awake in the New American Standard, in Greek means to keep an alert. It's figurative, to be on alert, to be watchful. Our eyes, keep our eyes open. And so the Christians living through the severe persecution of Imperial Rome need to be spiritually prepared for the Lord's coming. He's going to come, okay? To be spiritually prepared, they had to be faithful to Christ and not receive the mark of the beast or worship his image. Now, what we're seeing here, of course, is not really what we're seeing here is just really things sort of being set up for really what's coming, and that's in verse 16. So we're talking about sort of the battle of Armageddon.
We shouldn't just be ready for Christ's coming. We're not promised tomorrow.
Right.
And you can die in the next second,
Right.
next day, and stuff. We can walk out here and get killed.
Right.
You don't know what's
There's
gonna
always two variables in play: the second coming of Christ and one's death. Yep.
I have a question about verse 15 as a
Yep.
whole. Does yours have the parentheses around it?
It
What
does.
does that mean?
That's a good question, and I don't know, and I'll have to look up.
Okay.
Okay, so that might be
What was that, Ron?
I said verse 15, mine has got parentheses around the whole verse. And I wondered what
yeah.
that meant.
Sometimes
That's
when you
verse
see that,
15?
sometimes you see that, not all versions have, it may be a sort of a parenthetical statement, but I really have to look at that to see if that's the case there.
And then Jenna had a question.
Jenna?
For verse 14,
Right.
what do kings represent?
Well, it seems like, if we went through a few different scenarios, it seems like all of the evil forces of the world. So we're talking about Imperial Rome and anybody who may align themselves with that, essentially coming together as one massive force to fight against God. Yeah.
Okay, the people that's dead from Rome that you're talking about, them people aren't coming alive and coming back. They're just, what are you talking about here? Because when you're talking about Rome,
Right. Now I'm really talking about things that have already taken place.
yeah, they've taken place.
They've already taken place.
The premillennial
Premillennialists, yeah.
premillennial people are talking about these things are,
Future.
the future
Right.
that are to come, but these
Right.
things are already been spoken about right
Right.
in the Bible.
Because ancient Rome fell in 476 AD.
Have you got down to the Armageddon yet?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
But I mean, we're looking at this, when John's writing this, there's, Imperial Rome is still in power. This is about 96 AD. Imperial Rome is still very much in power. Okay, so
Uh-huh.
that's not going to change for a while. Okay, so they're still the power. And as we know from historical sense, these are all visions. And historically, there is not an alignment with the visions. The visions are to communicate truth, that God is going to be victorious over them, and so are Christians. They're not essentially given in terms of what's actually going to play out in actuality historically. But in the end, the idea is that God was essentially destroyed Rome. He essentially took them out of being a world power. And so Christ was the victor, and Christians were victorious, and it's good that they didn't worship
Well,
the
Rome
beast.
was disgusting.
Yeah.
They were very evil, nasty
Yeah.
people. They're
But
the
they
ones
didn't
that-
start out that way. They became that way by adopting a lot of the Greek influence.
They're the
Yeah.
ones that killed Jesus, I believe, or they.
Well, I mean, they were the instrument, but essentially,
And it was
remember,
the Jews that,
right,
yeah,
it was,
sent over. But,
they essentially, just like they tried to set up Pilate. Pilate doesn't want to do it, but he realizes my back's up against the wall. Okay, well, I'll do it. So I'm going to wash my hands and say, hey, the Lord's blood is on you, not on me. But go ahead and crucify him.
But it's still in him.
Yeah. Yep. So let's get on to 16 here before we get way too much time here. It says, and they gathered them together to the place which is in Hebrew is called Armageddon. There are a lot of translations that just say Armageddon. We'll get to that a little bit, the difference. Couple couple of quotes here from premillennialist Tim LaHaye in his Revelation Illustrated made plain, says, quote, "The Battle of Armageddon is an expression often used to describe the decisive battle between the Antichrist and his God-hating forces of the earth and Christ." One of the things that we've drawn out before and already went through, so I'm not going to back up and talk about it, is the Antichrist is never mentioned in the book of Revelation. It is sort of brought out from the epistles of John, brought over in there, and essentially he becomes the sort of the supreme leader of, when you look at premillennialism, he becomes sort of like in the role of the sea beast, and he becomes the one that wants to be worshipped and all of that stuff. Okay, John F. Wolford in his Every Prophecy of the Bible, clear explanations for uncertain times by one of today's premier prophecy scholars, says, quote, "The armies from all over the world are gathered geographically to the Holy Land, apparently to fight it out for power. The enticement of the demons is apparently effective because the armies of the world assembled to fight it out in the Holy Land, which seems to be a contradiction. The answer to this puzzle is found in Revelation 19 as the second coming of Christ is revealed. What Satan is doing is gathering all the military power of the world in a vain attempt to contend with the army from heaven." In other words, in some ways, again, as I pointed out before, this represents what we're actually talking about in ancient Rome. But they're saying, no, this same sort of scenario doesn't apply to the seven churches of Asia. This is a whole different thing. This all goes ahead to a future time, but it's very similar in a lot of ways. Hal Lindsey, in his book, There's a New World Coming, says, quote, "At least 300 million soldiers strung out across the entire Middle East and poised for the final mad act, which is war. The human waves of the East," and by that he means Oriental countries united under the Red Chinese Army, "are pitted against the superior weaponry of the West." And they, by that he means sort of combined forces of Western civilization united under the leadership of the future Roman dictator. He said, "Then it happens, the final battle begins. The horrible carnage of the Valley of Armageddon multiplied, millions of soldiers slaughtering each other in and around Israel." And so they have this massive battle. This is going to take place, and even, they have different ideas about, Hal Lindsey's idea of, they're going to fight out, and then all of a sudden the Lord's going to show up, or they're fighting against Israel. They're all going to fight, and then the Lord shows up in the second coming. This is the kind of ideas they have. But this Armageddon is located roughly 25 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee in the parcel of land once belonging to Manasseh on the west side of the Jordan River. The name Armageddon is, the word Har means a hill or a mountain. So it's the hill or the mountain of Megiddo. There was a plain of Megiddo that we're talking about Armageddon. We're talking about the hill or the mountain. And apparently this location is the crossroads of two ancient trade routes, and thus was a strategic military site in which many ancient battles were fought. That's from Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary. Baker's Evangelical Dictionary of Biblical Theology points out that it is natural that John should use, talking about Armageddon, to locate the final great battle on earth. John sees the final triumph of God at Armageddon and offers that to persecuted Christians as a word of comfort and hope that evil will not win, but is doomed to ultimate destruction. And so, according to premillennialists, when you start reading a lot of their things, they think they grabbed the 200 million soldiers from earlier, and they bring them to this parcel of land, which is 20 miles long, 14 miles wide, and it's just too small for 200 million soldiers. But they essentially have them sort of spread out in a wider capacity than just in that designated spot. And all too often the idea is they sort of pick and choose the details to make literal versus figurative. It seems like When it's convenient to make it literal, they make it literal. If it's not convenient, then they do something else with it. And it's really not being really following through or consistent with really what they believe that the book of Revelation says. Okay, any questions about sort of the Battle of Armageddon? It's not a real battle. It is a vision that John sees of evil forces sort of coming together to fight sort of God and Christ and his army. But that doesn't happen here. This is all sort of being set up for this battle to take place that we're going to read more about in chapter 19. Okay. Well, let's get on then to verses 17 through 21. Ryan, do you want to read that?
Sure. Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, "It is done." And there were flashes of lightning, and sounds, and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe.
Okay, again, this is the 7th bowl judgment. Again, remember, this is a vision. We get into trouble when we want to say, well, I don't remember reading about that historically. Is this going to happen at some point? This is all in a vision. Imagine John sort of watching a movie. And this vision, he sees this vision is a vision like really a series of visions. So that keeps us from really trying to give in and take it literally. The rule of thumb when we study the Bible is we take things as literal as possible when they're intended to be literal. But obviously not everything in the Bible is intended to be literal. So the Bible is both literal and figurative, and that's determined by the context. And when John tells us he's seeing a vision, that's telling us it cannot be literal. So what we're seeing is really sort of the judgment of God being explained through different imagery so that we can really see the impact of God's judgment upon really the wicked here. So in verse 17, it says, the 7th angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." Remember the number 7 is the most sacred number of the Hebrew mind according to biblical numerology, so we're not taking that literal. It represents the sacred or perfect. So this 7th bowl by the 7th angel is poured out. But unlike what happened with the previous 6 bowls being poured out, we're not told immediately in this verse what's going on here. But we hear a voice that came out of heaven, out of the throne, as saying, "It is done." And so in order for us to understand what's being meant here, you have to go back to the end of chapter 15. Remember at the end of chapter 15, verses 7 and 8, you have one of the 4 living creatures giving the 7 angels the 7 bowls of God's wrath. And you'll recall that the temple after that fills up with smoke from the glory of God, from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels are finished. Once the 7th bowl is poured out, now essentially, the smoke is going to clear. People can go back to the temple. Now this temple is in heaven, but we're just going by what John is sharing us with here. So verse 18, it says, "And there were flashes of lightning, sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty." John's explained this. Imagine seeing all these things and writing these down and making the comments that he is so that his audience can really understand what John is saying in this message of encouragement. Hal Lindsey, in his book, There's a New World Coming, says every city in the world is going to be leveled. Now, this is a premillennialist thought here. This will take place by what is called an earthquake, but that's not the only meaning. The word itself simply means a great shaking of earth. The earth could be shaken either by a literal earthquake or by full-scale nuclear exchange of all remaining missiles. I lean towards the nuclear conflict, and it's at this time the cities of the nations fall. Well, John doesn't know what a nuclear missile is. John is seeing an earthquake. So an earthquake is an earthquake. When you see an earthquake in a vision, it can't be a nuclear missile. It can't be a bunch of nuclear missiles going off. And so the idea is that when Hal Lindsey writes this, or other premillennialists, they're forgetting that this is what John would have understood to be. This is what his readers would have understood. Again, the lightning, the thunder, earthquake are not things that have no meaning, the idea that they just happen. In a biblical perspective, for instance, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says that, in talking about lightning, indicates the power of God. That the power of God is shown in his command of the forces of nature. And so the idea that here's God's power. What are we talking about? We're talking about judgment coming upon the enemies of God. We've got lightning going. God's power is being shown. Then we have thunder. Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says that it is a symbol of God's power as well. And imagery of thunder speaks of the powerful presence of God. And so you're seeing these things going on, and they're essentially speaking volumes to Christians. The idea is that this has got God's all over it in terms of what's happening here. Earthquake. Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says that the earthquake as a symbol of apocalyptic terrors. And so when you read through the Old Testament, you're going to see some of these same things being used in descriptive of God's judgment coming upon enemies and stuff in the Old Testament. And so when Christians seen this here, they didn't just think, oh wow, it's going to be some really big display of God, but they understood that God's power was at work. And so the earth was occupied by the Roman Empire, but it all is in the hand of God, and they are under his power and his might. And John in his vision is really showing that God is in control. And while they may rule on earth, God rules from heaven, and he's in control of all the elements. Okay, verse 19. John says, and a great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. John F. Walford, every prophecy of the Bible says, quote, the city of Babylon on the Euphrates, there are many indications in Scripture that this will be rebuilt and possibly made the capital city of the world empire. Now he's talking premillennial stuff, the idea down the road sometime. Okay, but Babylon had been destroyed. Now we know Saddam is saying rebuilt a lot of the city of Babylon, but it's a far cry from the Babylon that existed back in its heyday. And the trouble with taking this literal is we're talking about something in John's time that's non-existent. Where was Babylon? Where was Babylon? It was in ruins. So is John really talking about Babylon? Who's John talking about?
Rome.
He's talking about Rome. In other words, they were enemies of God. Babylon back in the day were enemies of God. They really took God's people into captivity. And essentially, we need a code name for Imperial Rome, or for Rome itself. Hey, we're going to use Babylon. So when we read about Babylon, we're not talking about the Babylon, but we're talking about something that represents Babylon, which is the same way in terms of being an enemy, and that is Rome itself. It says, in the great city, this is Babylon, split into 3 parts. It's split in 3 parts because of the earthquake. The earth had huge implications for the city. The idea that this great city was once great, and now that it's been split into 3 places, it's really been brought to its knees. It isn't what it was before God essentially inflicted this great earthquake upon it. It says, and all the cities of the nations fell. And these are really talking about countries other than really Israel, or in this case would be, God's spiritual Israel, God's people. So these were nations that were associated or allies of Imperial Rome. They're also going to suffer as a result. Their cities are also going to be devastated as a result. It says, and Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. Now this is a cup you don't want to drink. This is not a cup that they're going to want to drink. And this language has been used earlier in Revelation 14, 9 through 11. I'm going to read this. Don't have time to spend a lot of time with this, but it says in Revelation 14, 9 through 11, it says, and another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast in his image, this is emperor worship, and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, you're going to have that if you worship the beast. In the vision, you're going to have that. So if you're worshiping the beast, okay, you're marked. It says, he will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day and night. Those who worship the beast in his image and whoever receives the mark of his name. He's clearly telling you, you don't want to worship this. It might be the easiest thing to do as Christians. Hey, just bow the knee. Give some incense. Say Caesar is God. I go home. They're going to leave my family alone. They're going to leave me alone. He's saying it's not going to pay, because God's going to essentially punish everybody who worships this false god, the emperor. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, talking about the wrath here of God, says the wrath of God is objectified as wine in Revelation 14, 10, 16, 19, and 19, 15. And there is a reference in vials of wrath in 15, 7 and 16, 1, and to the cup of wrath in 14, 9. It says the idea of a cup of wrath or of wine of wrath comes from the Old Testament. The suffering which man brings on himself is represented as a drink, a cup or wine, which God hands to him in anger. In other words, because you're doing this, you're essentially doing it yourself, and you're going to bear God's wrath. I'm going to finish this up, and then we'll come back to some questions real quick at the end. Verse 20, it says, and every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Again, this is in the vision. This took place, something similar in Revelation 6:14. This is the result here of a catastrophic earthquake that hit Rome in the vision. And essentially, John sort of sees, islands moving away from where Rome is, and mountains essentially disappearing, which would be pretty breathtaking to see. In verse 21, John says, and huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe. And so we think about the difference in hail. Pea-sized hail can't hardly do anything. But you get to, golf ball size, softball size, things like that, it can destroy a lot of property. Here, in John's vision, these are 100 pounds each, which means, it's going to be pretty devastating for anybody who's in the immediate area, okay? So, John, in bringing this up, this is reminiscent of the plagues of Egypt. In particular, it was the 7th plague that was used by God to destroy the crops and the cattle, Exodus 9, 13 to 35. John's vision sort of sees this after a great earthquake. It doesn't get better for them. In other words, they're pretty devastated already, and now there's more punishment being inflicted on top of that. Hailstones, according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, it says, often spoken of as a means of punishing the wicked. And the idea is God is not going to cut them any slack. They chose to do the evil that they're doing. You'll recall that they've had a chance with the eternal gospel. The idea is come away from worshiping a false god, worship the true God of heaven. These are the people that essentially refuse to do that. They're not going to do it. And the sad thing about this, as John says here, it came down, these hailstones came down down from heaven upon men, and the men blasphemed God because of the plague of hail. And the idea here of blaspheming is showing contempt or lack of reverence for God. And so they're defiant. These people are gonna be defiant to the end. God is raining down judgment on them. They're not gonna repent. In fact, as they're suffering because of God's anger in putting the plagues on them, what they do instead of changing their mind and coming to repentance is they blaspheme God. So, any questions or comments?
Well, the one that you said you're gonna come back to that you didn't explain, up there, the Armageddon,
Okay.
elaborate more on that.
Yeah, it's not an actual battle. This is a vision that John sees in heaven of all these armies coming together to fight against God. If you're dealing with premillennialists, this is all actual, and it's gonna happen
Yeah, 'cause
sometime
that's
in the
what
future.
I've said, there's not gonna be an Armageddon here on earth like they say.
It just represents sort of the idea of, the evil forces of man fighting against really God, and God's gonna have the upper hand. In other words, they're not going to win.
Yeah.
So, It's sort of ridiculous when premillennialists say this battle's gonna take place, and so they're gonna bring, all their conventional armor or warfare, and they're gonna bring nuclear weapons, and even though they're gonna get slaughtered, supposedly they're gonna fight a battle. It's not gonna be much of a battle. If that was to take place, it's not gonna be a battle at all, because there's no way to defeat God. So
No.
why even suit up? Why even bring anything together in the battle, in Megiddo? Why even go through all that if essentially you're not going to win?
Devil was stupid to think he
Yeah.
could beat God. I mean,
Yeah.
he ain't, we're all at God's mercy. I
Right.
mean,
Right.
humankind, it's stupid to think humankind
Right.
can overpower God
Right.
and stuff. That's not what happened. God.
So your best friend is sort of just recognize these are visions. When people start talking literal, they're thinking premillennials. These are visions John is going to see for the purpose of encouraging Christians being persecuted in the first few centuries there to essentially remain faithful, because they're going to be the conquerors, the victors, and those persecuting will essentially be punished by God. Jenna?
When the translators translate it, when do they do that? Do they do it like on a Sunday, like the first day of the week, where they translate the text of Revelation?
I don't know what they would have.
Or does it matter? Like, how do they do that? Like,
Oh,
how-
but they just get the ancient manuscripts and they pick whatever day they're going to do it, whenever they were doing that, to put it into, they're familiar with whether it's Hebrew, the Old Testament, Koine Greek, the New Testament. I mean, essentially, as they found these documents in these languages, they translated them into English and German and whatever else, whatever time they decided to do that.
I mean, when did they share it with the people?
When they start with what?
Sharing it with the people?
Sharing them?
Yeah, like with the Christians are.
Well, you'd have the original writing here of John, so John basically has one writing, which, because it survives today in multiple copies, we know that essentially the original was copied multiple times, and then it was essentially given to, passed around the churches. Eventually, people had private copies of them, and so that's kind of the idea, that you don't have anywhere to put them in a copy machine and do that. You've got to really line by line reproduce that.
What
Yeah.
was your question, Jenna?
About the translators?
Translators of the Bible?
No, of Revelation.
Revelation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So John has one copy, and from there it becomes multiple copies to a process in which
Well,
to
the
share with
Bible,
other people,
God
because
had-
you have one copy. It's not going to go very far and wide, and it's going to get overused. It has to be multiplied.
God had scribes copy the Bible and stuff too, so
Right.
what we know is accurate,
Yep.
as long as we tell the truth
Right.
of the scripture. So there's no way it could be twisted or turned around.
Right.
It is what it is.
Right.
And you have to be, a true follower of Christ to know what it says.
Yep.
Now this, we need you to explain a lot of this because
Yeah.
we don't understand.
Yeah.
Even you have problems
Well,
understanding
you have
a
to
lot
study
of
the
it.
Bible. It's not all easy. Book of Revelation is one of the hardest. If you're talking about a handful
That's why
of
I
books,
say you
one of
should know the
hardest.
study the whole
Yeah.
Bible before you
Yep.
study
You,
Revelations.
It said to the 7 churches in Asia.
Right.
He didn't send it to Jerusalem, so I don't think there was no translator. Everybody was able to understand it, just different areas.
Right, so it went to the 7 churches of Asia. Eventually, the application goes to more of a general audience. In other words, we can read the book of Revelation today, recognizing a lot of these things has in the past, and not treat it as if it doesn't apply to us. In other words, if we're with Christ and our government turns against us, and our government says, you're gonna do this, and we said, no, we're gonna follow Christ, and they start persecuting us, this is encouraging. Who's gonna win at the end of the day? Well, God is, and God's people. So that's where we draw the encouragement of this book today, and not sort of leaving it in the past and say, well, that was nice for them, but here we are today. So anyway, we're gonna sign out. I wanna thank those who have seen the video for watching it. Hope it was encouraging to you, and Lord willing, a week from now, we'll have another video of Revelation chapter 17. God bless.